so happy we alive.
A while, we'll have something to go on. And people will be forced to turn to some of us who have been talking about these issues. That's another good reason why Ann Braden and Miles Horton and Ella Baker and the others were very important. They were saying, look, you got a deep problem in the South here, and if you don't come to terms with it, chicken's going to come home to roost. People just still sleepwalking. Sooner or later, stuff hits the fan. Oh, we better listen to what Ella got to say. We better listen to what Ann Braden got to say. We better listen to what Martin got to say. That's just Ann right there. Come right on up, those. Let's give her a hand. Let's give her a hand. Sit anywhere you want to sit, my dear sister. But they had already said that there was a problem, and when the problem became a crisis, people then had to acknowledge that their vision, that their concerns now had become center stage, when before people had tried to push them to the margins. That's the difference between those who are highly alert, awakened, mature, concerned about the dignity of everyday people, and people who are sleepwalking, sometimes using a language or rhetoric of democracy, but actually afraid of it, actually threatened by it. See, the last thing most elites in this society want is a full-scale democratic awakening. It would scare them to death. You see, it's the last thing they want. Why? Because if you get all these working people and poor people who awaken and say, you know what? I really do have a right to health care. I have a right to a job with a living wage. I have a right not to be treated in a sexist, racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Arab racist way and so forth. I have a right to that, and I won't put up with it any longer. Then you got some serious changes. See, most politicians be scared to death. And the corporate elites be shaking in their boots. Well, persons like myself, Democrats, small d, and Christian, capital C, that's what one's life is about. You see, awakening folk, getting to see that love and justice ought to sit at the center of what it means to be human. And that takes unbelievable vigilance, persistence. Then, of course, you fall on your face, you bounce back. Fall on your face, you bounce back. Very much. We had a question. Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought your wonderful son.
My grandson.
Your grandson, that's right. Let's give Brother Marquis a hand here. Yeah. Well, 6 years old, looking like a president. Go right here.
Rashid McClain, just shooting for the Kentucky Alliance office. Got two questions. One, there's some particular language in the federal and state constitutions that have to do with legalizing slavery. I think most people are still under the impression that it was done away with back in the 1860s. Talk about that, and also talk about how our traditional religious institutions still compromise political ideology, allowing public officials to come in and set up shop when we know that Christ's position was strongly and absolutely against that. In my opinion, I think it's one of the big problems where we allow political ideologies to dominate every other institution in this society.
Oh, those are two big questions, though, brother. Let's start with that second question, though, because there's no doubt that you can't talk about democratic awakening in this society unless you come to terms with the prophetic possibilities of religion. Not just Christianity, but Judaism and Buddhism and other religions as well. 97% of fellow citizens believe in God in America. 97%. It's one of the highest any nation in the world. 80% believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's 8 out of 10. About 53% are on intimate terms with God in terms of dialogue daily. Now, given that profile, how are you going to talk about democratic awakening if you don't talk about religion? Now, historically, we know when it comes to both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, let's talk about the three religions which are the dominant in society, especially Christianity. that Judaism is fundamentally about justice. It's fundamentally about justice. Do justice. Love, mercy, walk humbly with that God. You can't talk about Jesus without talking about Judaism. Most Americans don't want to acknowledge he was a Jew. Mel Gibson in his film, The Passion, I want a literalist, fundamentalist interpretation of Jesus, but won't make him Jewish. That's interesting. European, but not Jewish. Oh, I see how literalist you really are. Very interesting. Why is that important? Well, because Jews in the Roman Empire were oppressed, persecuted, demeaned, degraded peoples. Subjugated, oppressed. See, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he goes into a Roman Empire, right? And he goes to the temple, right? And he believes in nonviolence, but he has righteous indignation in the temple. The marketeering, the money lenders, and so forth, that had colonized the temple. See, that's what gets him in trouble. He's put to death by who? The elites of the Roman Empire. Now, as we know, a few hundred years later, Constantine appropriates the movement that Jesus initiates as his religion. So you get a radical distinction between Jesus and what he was about versus Constantinian Christianity, in which his movement sits comfortably with the very people who would put Jesus to death. The Christian cross is the sign of the night side of the Roman Empire. That's where political prisoners of the empire were murdered, assassinated, crucified. 300 years later, these Christians sitting around with the elites of the empire, persecuting others, that's right, assassinating others. What happens here? Well, you end up with organized religion in its dominant forms sitting comfortably with the power. And then still have the nerve, with all of their luxury and all of their complacency and indifference to the least of these, to put Jesus at the center of their Constantinian Christian project. This is dangerous stuff. Has a long history. There's Constantinian Judaism. There's Constantinian Buddhism. There's Constantinian Hinduism. There's Constantinian Islam. Look at Constantinian Islam versus Muhammad. Muhammad creates the state, the first Islamic state, right? In Medina, Jews had equal status with the Muslims. Very different vision, right? The last thing he says is what? Make sure that there's no respecter of persons. Jews, Christians, Islam, or whatever. We can go on and on, right? His very daughter marries his slave, Bilal, which is the name that Elijah Muhammad used for black people. So we can go on and on. The tremendous difference between prophetic religion and Constantinian religion. So when we look at the present day, we shouldn't be surprised, but we should be very critical. You look at the Pat Robinsons, you look at the Jerry Falwells, you look at the conservative rabbis, you look at the conservative Buddhists, the conservative Hindus, and this is where it gets real fascinating, because for so long the black church at its best was one place where high quality leadership was produced, owing to commitment to a Jesus who was a victim of the Roman Empire. Now you get more and more Constantinian Christian activity in the black church as they get closer and closer to the elites of the American empire, in the Bush administration.
Now,
Yes?
I don't want to take up, I want, if you would, just address very quickly how the political institutions tend to dominate the religious, the social, the academic, the medical, and so forth. There's some language in the federal and state constitution that is called dead letter language, yet it says that slavery can be practiced by the state rather than a private citizen. But when you look at some of these Confederate states during the 1860s, most of those states are the same states that were the first ones to approve private prisons. Kentucky is one of those states also, going back into